On December 1st, 2025, while the political air in Washington was thick with the usual rhetoric of dominance and the sounds of administrative upheaval, a quiet but seismic shift occurred in the halls of power in Ottawa and Brussels. It was a move that went largely unnoticed by the 24-hour news cycle, yet it represents perhaps the most significant realignment of Western power since the end of the Second World War. Canada has done something that was, until very recently, considered diplomatically and legally impossible. It has successfully negotiated its way into the most exclusive defense framework on the planet, securing a future that is no longer tethered solely to the whims of the United States. This isn't just about a trade agreement, and it certainly isn't about political theater. This is about the fundamental restructuring of how a sovereign nation protects its interests when its traditional protector becomes its primary source of economic instability. By the time we finish this analysis, you will understand why this quiet announcement involving $244 billion Canadian dollars has effectively shattered the old assumptions of North American security. We are looking at the birth of a new era, one defined not by continental loyalty but by strategic survival. I am Daniel Kershaw. I am an independent legal and political journalist. I do not work for any campaign, any political party, or any government agency. My role here is to remain objective, to look past the slogans, and to examine the underlying legal frameworks and verifiable data. For those of you who have followed my work, you know that I prioritize the rule of law and constitutional integrity over partisan talking points. What we are discussing today is a matter of profound legal and geopolitical importance. The big question at the heart of today's analysis is simple but heavy. At what point does the cost of a special relationship become too high for a sovereign democracy to bear? If you are a taxpayer, a homeowner, or someone who simply values a stable legal system, you need to understand that when a country as stable as Canada makes a bet this large on an ocean-away partner, the ground beneath all of us has shifted. To understand the gravity of the current situation, we must first look at the mechanism itself. The European Union has been developing a project known as SAFE, Security Action for Europe. From a legal perspective, this is not merely a military alliance, it is a financial and industrial juggernaut. We are talking about 150 billion euros, roughly 244 billion Canadian dollars, in low-interest EU-backed loans designed to rebuild the continent's military-industrial base from the ground up. When you actually read the court filings and the institutional documents surrounding SAFE, you see that it was designed as a closed loop. It was meant to be exclusively for EU member states to ensure that European taxpayer money stayed within European borders. This exclusivity was a hard legal boundary. The United Kingdom, even with its deep historical ties to the continent, was rebuffed after Brexit. Australia, despite its strategic importance in the Pacific, could not secure a seat. Even the United States, the traditional cornerstone of NATO, remains on the outside of this specific financial framework. Yet on December 1st, 2025, Canada became the first non-European nation to be granted full participatory rights. This is a detail that most mainstream reports have brushed over, but for anyone who cares about the rule of law, this raises immediate questions. How did Ottawa secure such a radical departure from EU precedent? The answer lies in a series of quiet legal negotiations that began long before the public was aware. We have to look at the timeline to understand why Canada was driven to such an extreme measure. For decades, the legal and economic reality for Canada was one of total continental integration. Over 70% of Canadian defense spending went directly into the United States. Our supply chains were not just linked, they were fused. But in 2025, that fusion began to create friction that was no longer sustainable. Early in 2025, the administration in Washington moved beyond mere rhetoric. They imposed a 25% tariff on nearly all Canadian goods, citing trade imbalances and political grievances. By the summer of 2025, after Canada took a sovereign stance on Middle Eastern diplomacy that diverged from Washington's preferences, those tariffs were threatened to increase to 35%. We saw the weaponization of trade in a way that directly targeted the Canadian automobile, steel, and aluminum sectors. From a legal standpoint, this was a violation of the spirit, if not the letter, of our continental trade agreements. It was economic warfare disguised as domestic policy. For the Canadian leadership, the realization was stark. The United States was no longer a predictable legal partner. If you are a business owner or a worker in Windsor or Oshawa, you know that you cannot plan for a 30-year career when your primary market can be closed off by a single executive order on a Tuesday morning. This brings us to a pivotal moment in Canadian political history. In January 2025, Justin Trudeau announced his resignation. The country was exhausted, and the Liberal Party was facing a 26-point deficit in the polls. Enter Mark Carney. Carney is not a traditional politician. He is a creature of the high finance and legal world, having served as the governor of both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England. When Carney won the Liberal leadership in March 2025 with an 85.9% mandate, he didn't just change the party's platform, he changed the nation's strategic calculus. He approached the problem of American unpredictability not as a grievance, but as a risk management exercise. He understood that a country of 40 million people cannot survive as a vassal state to a neighbor that no longer respects the established rules of the game. In June 2025, just 3 months after taking office, Carney signed a quiet security partnership with the EU. At the time, many dismissed it as a diplomatic formality, but if you look at the timeline closely, that was the moment the legal groundwork for the SAFE deal was laid. Carney was building an exit ramp from the American defense monopoly. Now, here is the part where the story gets truly interesting, and it's a detail buried in the fine print of the procurement reports. Under standard SAFE guidelines, joint projects require that 65% of the components be produced within the EU. This is a massive legal barrier intended to protect European jobs. However, the December 1st agreement includes specific exemptions for Canada. In high-demand sectors, specifically drones, counter-drone systems, missile components, and cyber warfare capabilities, Canadian firms have been granted the right to contribute up to 80% of a system's value. Think about what that means. A company in Kitchener, Waterloo, or Montreal can now lead a project, fund it through EU-backed low-interest loans, and sell that technology to 27 different European nations on the same legal footing as a French or German firm. This is not just an export opportunity, it is a full-scale integration of the Canadian industrial base into the European economy. From a legal perspective, this is a brilliant maneuver. It bypasses the Buy American provisions that have plagued Canadian manufacturers for years. It replaces a single, unpredictable buyer, Washington, with a stable, rules-based consortium of 27 nations. For anyone who cares about the rule of law, this is a move toward a more stable, predictable industrial future. We also need to discuss the financing, because money is the language of sovereignty. The European Union borrows on global markets using its collective 8AA credit rating. It then lends those funds to participating governments and firms essentially at cost. By joining SAFE, Canadian defense companies now have access to this capital. This is a detail that most people miss, but it is the key to why this deal is a multi-generational commitment. In the defense world, production cycles take decades. You don't just build a missile system overnight. You build a factory, you train a workforce, and you establish a 30-year supply chain. Access to EU-backed financing provides the kind of long-term certainty that the current political climate in Washington simply cannot offer. Canada even paid an entry fee to join SAFE. While the exact amount remains undisclosed, this fee is a legal buy-in that gives Canadian firms a permanent stake in the financing pool. This isn't a temporary trade deal that expires after one election cycle. This is a structural change to the Canadian state. Let's step back and look at the bigger picture. For the entire post-Cold War era, the Western alliance was built on one central pillar: American security guarantees. European countries and Canada underfunded their militaries because they believed the United States would always be the adult in the room. Canada was often criticized for being a free rider, spending only about 1.3% to 1.4% of its GDP on defense. But that social contract has been torn up. When a U.S. president openly questions the value of NATO, threatens allies with annexations, and uses tariffs as a primary tool of diplomacy, The free rider era ends. It is replaced by the self-preservation era. The message sent by the European Union is just as powerful. They looked at the global landscape. They looked at the Five Eyes intelligence partners. They looked at Japan and South Korea, and they chose Canada. Why? Because in the current legal and political climate, Canada is seen as the only North American partner that doesn't weaponize its trade or abandon its treaties based on the latest polling data. This is a massive endorsement of Canadian legal and diplomatic stability. This gives Canada something it has never truly had in its relationship with the United States: leverage. For the last century, if Washington threatened Canada, Canada had to fold. There were no other options. But now, if a future American administration tries to bully Ottawa, the Canadian Prime Minister can point to the SAFE Agreement and say, "We have other options." Our industry is now tied to 27 other democracies that value partnerships over domination. However, as an independent analyst, I have to be clear, this is not a guaranteed victory. There are serious legal and political risks that could derail this entire strategy. First, the European Union is not a monolith. It is a collection of 27 separate nations, each with its own history, its own defense priorities, and its own entrenched bureaucracies. Navigating the procurement systems of France, Germany, and Poland simultaneously is a monumental task. A project that is approved in Brussels could still be blocked by a national government in Berlin or Rome. Canada is trading one unpredictable partner for 27 complex ones. Second, there is the risk of American retaliation. We have already seen that the current administration in Washington views any move toward strategic independence as an act of disloyalty. If American defense contractors, who are among the most powerful lobbyists in the world, realize they are being shut out of European markets by Canadian firms using EU money, the political pressure on Canada will be immense. We could see a further escalation of tariffs or even legal challenges within international trade bodies. Third, there is the technical challenge of integration. Canadian companies have spent 80 years building components that fit American standards. Moving to European standards is not just a matter of changing a few parts. It requires a total overhaul of engineering processes, quality certifications, and security protocols. This will take years and billions of dollars in private investment. Some companies will inevitably fail to make the transition. If you are feeling exhausted by all of this, I don't blame you. Most people don't have the time to read through hundreds of pages of defense procurement filings or international loan agreements. It's much easier to focus on the loud headlines and the political drama. But here is why this matters to you, the person who goes to work, pays their taxes, and worries about their mortgage. These high-level legal maneuvers are what determine whether your local economy survives the next decade. When Canada's industrial base is fused to a stable 27-nation market, it creates a floor under the Canadian economy that wasn't there before. It means that the value of your home, the stability of your pension, and the availability of high-tech jobs are no longer entirely dependent on who wins a single election in a foreign capital. For those who value the rule of law, this is a moment of profound significance. It is a reminder that sovereignty is not something you are given. It is something you maintain through careful, sometimes painful strategic choices. The SAFE Agreement is done, but the real work begins now. We expect the official ratification and the launch of the first bidding cycles in early 2026. The European Union has a target of being fully military ready by 2030. That means over the next 5 years, we are going to see an explosion of defense spending upward of €1 trillion when you combine SAFE loans with national budgets. The new Canadian Defence Investment Agency will be the hub for this. They will be responsible for ensuring that Canadian firms actually get their piece of that €1 trillion pie. If they execute this well, the spillover effect into civilian sectors, AI, sensors, materials science, could transform the entire Canadian economy. But the biggest test will be the next Canadian federal election. Mark Carney must call a vote no later than October 2025. If he wins, this European strategy becomes the law of the land for the next 4 years. If he loses and the Conservatives under Pierre Poilievre take over, the future of the SAFE partnership is unclear. Poilievre has been largely silent on this issue, and the Conservative Party has historically favored repairing the relationship with the United States above all else. From a legal and political perspective, the conclusion is undeniable. The old assumptions about Western security, that Canada is a junior partner with no options, that the U.S. will always provide a stable umbrella, and that the Atlantic is a barrier rather than a bridge have been shattered. Canada has looked at the chaos and unpredictability of modern politics and made a calculated, cold-blooded decision to diversify. They didn't do it with threats or dramatic speeches. They did it by quietly negotiating their way into the most exclusive room in the world. They secured terms that give their companies unprecedented access and position themselves as the critical bridge between North America and Europe at the exact moment when that bridge is most needed. Whether this turns out to be a brilliant strategy or a catastrophic miscalculation will not be clear for years. But what is clear right now is that Canada is no longer a passive observer of its own fate. It is a strategic actor with options, leverage, and the willingness to use both. At its core, this case is about one question: is anyone still under the law, or is power now the only rule? By moving toward a rules-based, multilateral defense framework in Europe, Canada is betting that the future belongs to those who value predictable legal systems over the whims of individual leaders. As we watch this unfold, I want to hear from you. How do you feel about this shift? Do you believe that Canada's bet on Europe is the right move for our long-term economic and legal stability? Or do you worry that we are burning a bridge with our closest neighbor that can never be rebuilt? If you are a taxpayer, does it give you more confidence to know that our defense industry is diversifying? Or does the secret entry fee and the complexity of dealing with 27 European nations concern you? The rule of law only works when the public is informed and engaged. If you want to understand how these high-level legal shifts are impacting your life and your wallet, I invite you to stay tuned as we continue to track the implementation of the SAFE Agreement. This is a developing story with implications that will last for decades. If you found this analysis helpful, I encourage you to subscribe and join our community. We focus on the facts, the law, and the long-term trends that actually matter. I am Daniel Kershaw, and I thank you for your time and your commitment to understanding the complexities of our world. Until next time, stay informed and stay vigilant.